Hey there. Tonight, we are going to sit beside a river that remembers more than any empire ever could. Before there were maps, before there were court robes, before there were borders drawn with ink and blood, there was a story about a dragon lord from the water and a fairy from the mountains. And inside that old story was the first answer to the question that follows Vietnam across 4,000 years. How does a small farming people keep standing when larger powers keep arriving at the gate? The answer begins with water, mud, rice, memory, and a family so large it becomes a nation. And before we go any deeper, do take a second to like the video and subscribe. Only if this kind of slow history is your cup of tea. It helps more than you might think, which is a mildly unromantic thing to say at the edge of myth. But such is life. One hand on the sacred drum, one hand on the algorithm. Now let the room soften a little. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe in slowly and feel the air settle. Breathe out and imagine a warm night near the Red River. Damp earth underfoot, distant insects humming beyond the dark, and a faint thread of wood smoke rising into the black. We are not in a hurry here. Vietnam took a very long time to become Vietnam. We can give it a few quiet minutes. The old tale says that Black Long Quan came from the waters. He was a dragon lord, or perhaps more softly, a being of deep rivers, tidal breath, and the shifting skin of the coast. O Ko came from the mountains, a fairy princess linked to high forests, cloud-wrapped ridges, and the hidden force of the uplands. When they met, the story did not describe two strangers only. It described two landscapes learning how to live in one another. Sea and mountain, delta and height, floodplain and stone. If you were standing there with me, in that half-mythic beginning, you would hear how natural it feels. Vietnam is, after all, a country stretched between ridges and water. Its shape almost seems to ask for such a marriage. The coast reaches long and narrow. The mountains lean close. Rivers arrive carrying soil from far inland, then slow, split, and spread into fields that shine like polished metal after rain. It makes sense that a people living in such a place would imagine themselves born from two worlds at once. Then came the detail every child remembers. The couple produced 100 sons. Not 10, not 12, not some modest family suitable for a tax record. 100, a full and perfect number, an entire people tucked into a single cradle. In East Asian thought, such a number suggests completeness, a whole world gathered in one count. The tale did something very clever there. It allowed every region, every village, every lineage, every future difference to belong to one shared origin. However far apart the descendants might later live, they would still be kin. And yet the story does not end in permanent togetherness. That is one of the reasons it feels so mature. Lac Long Quan and Oko separate, not in rage, not in a storm of curses, but with a kind of sad wisdom. They recognize that one belongs more naturally to water, the other to the heights. 50 children go with their father toward the coastal lowlands. 50 go with their mother toward the mountains. It is a division, yes, but not a rupture. The family spreads without breaking. The land becomes varied without the people becoming strangers. Honestly, I have always found that part especially beautiful. Many national myths insist on unity by pretending difference does not exist. This one seems to say something subtler. You may live in different landscapes, speak with different accents, farm different soil, and still belong to the same long house of memory. That idea would prove very useful later, when foreign empires arrived with neat categories and expensive seals. Even now, when Vietnamese people speak of themselves as children of dragon and fairy, they are doing more than repeating folklore. They are stepping into an ancestry that stands outside the histories imposed by conquerors. Before any Chinese dynasty declared the region a frontier, before any French administrator drew up a survey, before any American strategist turned the country into a theory, there was already a people who could say, we began elsewhere, deeper, older, together. The Hung Kings sit inside this same zone of memory, half history, half sacred inheritance. Later tradition described them as descendants of the First Union, rulers of an early Vietnam, before written records become firm under our feet. At Hung Temple, in Phu To, generations have climbed the slopes, carrying offerings, incense, fruit, flowers, and that difficult thing no census can record, continuity. During the festival, the air thickens with prayer, smoke, and movement. Sandaled feet climb old stone steps worn smooth by thousands of earlier feet. Drums sound somewhere beyond the trees. Banners stir. A murmur passes through the crowd the way wind moves through rice. And in that moment, the myth is no longer trapped in the past. It is being used, refreshed, breathed again into the present. People bow, not because they have verified every detail, like suspicious accountants, but because nations also live on chosen memory. That is true everywhere, though some countries prefer not to admit it and instead behave like they were assembled by pure reason in a well-lit office. Beneath the poetry, scholars sometimes notice older social echoes. O Ko holds unusual prominence for an ancient tale, which may preserve traces of matrilineal patterns from very early societies. The split between mountain and coast may reflect the gradual merging of different tribal or ecological communities in prehistoric northern Vietnam. We cannot be entirely sure. These old stories do not arrive with helpful footnotes. Still, archaeology in the Red River Delta suggests that behind the legend, there were indeed early cultures of considerable sophistication, communities already shaping metal, water, and ritual long before foreign chroniclers noticed them. So let us step gently from myth into earth, from the dragon and the fairy into the first objects that survive the centuries with more stubbornness than paper. Bronze drums. Imagine one resting in torchlight. Heavy, Broad, cool to the touch, its surface carries rings and figures and birds and boats. It is not just an instrument. It is an announcement, a heartbeat given metal skin. The people we call Dong San, flourishing roughly from around 1000 BCE into the first centuries of the Common Era, left these extraordinary drums behind as if to say, we were here, we were organized, we understood ceremony, labor, rank, and beauty. The making of such a drum was no casual village hobby. Lost wax casting on that scale required planning, skill, heat control, molds, labor, and knowledge passed carefully from hand to hand. A clay form first, wax laid over it, details cut and pressed into the wax. Another clay shell around that. Fire. Waiting. The wax runs out, leaving a cavity. Then the bronze, glowing and dangerous, is poured in. It cools. The mold is broken away, and there it is, a drum born from fire and patience, weighing over 100 kilograms in the grandest cases, with surfaces so finely arranged that even now they feel intentional in every line. When struck, such a drum could gather a community. It could call people to ritual, to celebration, perhaps to warning. In war, it helped coordinate movement. In peace, it marked ceremony and rank. The most elaborate examples likely belonged to chiefs or ritual leaders, people whose authority moved through both politics and the spirit world. One can almost hear the sound rolling out across wet fields at dusk, a bronze note widening over houses on stilts, over tethered buffalo, over river branches reflecting the last of the light. The decorations matter just as much as the sound. On the drum faces, central star motif, 88, outward. Along the sides appear boats, paddlers, dancers, birds, feathered figures, farmers, musicians. These are not the marks of a forgotten people stumbling in the dark. They are a record of social life. You can see labor, ritual, hierarchy, movement, and belief arranged in circles, as if daily existence itself were part of a sacred rhythm. Birds appear often, especially long-legged water birds, perhaps egrets. They seem to move between earth and sky, mud and cloud, practical life and spiritual message. The world around those drums was a wet one. Fields depended on careful cooperation with monsoon waters. Rice agriculture was already highly developed, and that matters more than people sometimes realize. Wet rice farming does not merely feed people. It teaches them how to organize. You must know the seasons, maintain dikes, move water, share labor, and accept that one person's neglect may become everyone else's flood. A rice world rewards coordination. It also roots memory in place. The same field, the same embankment, the same canal, the same family names, returning season after season. The Dongsan people lived in houses raised on stilts above damp ground and floodwater, with animals below and human life above. They worked bronze not just into drums, but tools, weapons, ornaments. They wore jewelry and understood visual prestige. Their settlements were linked by trade and kinship. Their boats moved through the riverine landscape, and perhaps beyond it, far more than older histories once assumed. Dong Son drums have been found not only in northern Vietnam, but across mainland Southeast Asia and even farther afield, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and South India. That suggests maritime networks of surprising reach. Vietnam was not sealed away in some prehistoric pocket. It was already connected. I like to pause there because the old colonial habit was to imagine early Southeast Asia as passive until India or China or Europe showed up to teach it how to exist. The bronze says otherwise. The river says otherwise. The fields say otherwise. Before outside empires began writing insulting reports about the region, there were already societies here capable of artistry, technological skill, long-distance exchange, and organized leadership. Some historians think the leaders of this world, village, confederation chiefs, ritual authorities, lineage heads, may echo behind the later memory of the Hung Kings. We should be cautious. Myth and archaeology do not fit together like puzzle pieces cut by the same hand, but they do seem to lean in one another's direction. A remembered ancestral age, a bronze-rich culture in the Delta, communities strong enough to produce ceremonial objects of astonishing complexity. It is not hard to see how memory and material life could slowly braid together. Picture an evening in that world. Rain has passed. The sky is still low and gray at the edges, but a soft gold lingers over the paddies. Water stands between rice shoots, each flooded square holding a little piece of the sky. A child squats near the threshold of a stilt house, tracing circles in damp earth with a stick. Nearby, an older woman sorts grain with calm, practiced hands. A boat nudges against the bank. Men lift something wrapped in cloth and fiber from its center. It is heavy. They move carefully. The cloth comes away and catches the last light. Bronze, a drum. No one speaks loudly. Someone touches the rim as though greeting a living thing. That is the feeling I want you to keep. Not just a people surviving in a swampy margin of history, but a people already making a world, already beating time into metal, already learning that power can sit in a field, a river, a wall, a story, a family, a sound. From that foundation, the next step is almost inevitable. Confederations become kingdoms. Memory seeks a capital. A people with drums eventually makes fortresses. If you listen closely, you can already hear the theme that will repeat across the centuries. The people who live close to wet earth learn stubbornness. Farmers always do. They know the sky can ruin everything. They know the river can nourish and destroy in the same season. They know survival is not drama most days, but repetition. Mend the bank. Replant the row. Save the seed. Share the labor. Remember who helped when the water rose. Such habits do not look heroic from a distance, yet they are the muscles from which later resistance grows. Long before generals, there were cultivators. Long before banners, there were hands in mud. Vietnam begins there too. And soon, in the north, a mountain leader will gather scattered groups into something firmer, something more dangerous to his enemies, and perhaps to himself. A kingdom called Olak will rise from the old world of bronze and water, and around it, the earth will be piled into spiraling walls like the coils of a sleeping creature. The old bronze world did not vanish in a single dramatic night. It thickened into something sharper. Villages became political weight. River settlements became strategic ground. And sometime around 258 BCE, a figure emerged from the borderlands. Thuc Phan, remembered later as An Duong Vuong, who managed what earlier leaders had not fully done. He gathered the Oviet and Lac Viet into a more centralized kingdom called Olak. That sounds tidy when said quickly. History likes a good, neat sentence. But uniting different communities in an age of rivers, marshes, uplands, and local loyalties would have been slow. Tensy work. Messengers moving through rain. Oaths taken around fires. Chiefs persuaded, flattered, threatened, or married into alliance. Rice stores counted. Bronze checked. Defenses tested. A kingdom is not only declared, it is assembled. And Duong Vuong seems to have understood something essential at once. If this new state was going to survive, it could not rely on ancestry and enthusiasm alone. It needed walls. It needed an organized center. It needed a place where power could collect, store grain, control labor, and command roads and waterways. So the king built Koloa. Even now, the name has a curling quality to it, and that is fitting because the citadel was famous for its spiral design, a great nested defensive work whose earthworks rolled around the center like the coils of a snail shell. Near present-day Hanoi, the landscape was shaped into concentric rings of packed earth and timber, an immense labor for its time. Archaeologists have found evidence of ramparts, wooden reinforcements, and large-scale planning. The walls may have reached 12 meters high in places and extended for kilometers. This was no improvised refuge. It was an argument in earth. We are here. We intend to remain. Try to picture the making of it. Not the finished diagram in a textbook, but the labor itself. Baskets of soil lifted and carried. Feet sinking into wet ground. Wooden frames creaking as they were set in place. Orders shouted over hammering. Children watching from a safer distance while buffalo snorted beside cartloads of clay and timber. The smell would have been dense. Wet earth, cut wood, sweat, river water. Day after day the walls rose, layer by layer, tamped hard until they could hold shape against season and assault. Honestly, every old fortress carries a little vanity in it. It says, in effect, behold how seriously I take my own future. Koloa said it with unusual confidence. Excavation has strengthened the impression that Olak was more organized than an older style of tribal confederation. Tens of thousands of bronze arrowheads have been found, along with molds and signs of large-scale production. That means specialists, raw material control, labor concentration, and military preparation. It means someone was counting supply and probably worrying at night about whether they had counted enough. The romance of ancient kingship often leaves out clerks and quartermasters, which is unfair, because without them, the kingdom is just a speech in fancy clothing. And yet in Vietnam, practical reality so often shares the room with myth. Koloa is remembered not only as a strong citadel, but as a place touched by the supernatural. The story says the king was aided by a golden turtle spirit. This sacred being helped him complete the citadel and gave him a magical crossbow capable of felling enemies in terrifying numbers. It is easy for modern readers to smile politely at such things, the way people do when they want to seem very sensible. But the legend is worth lingering over. The turtle in Vietnamese imagination is not random decoration. It belongs to durability, wisdom, and the slow authority of sacred time. To receive help from such a being is to claim that this kingdom was not merely a convenient arrangement of force, but something with cosmic approval. The magical crossbow, meanwhile, says something equally important. Security is fragile. Power depends on what is guarded, and once its secret is lost, the kingdom becomes mortal. That is why the fall of Aulak enters memory not as a dry line of succession, but as one of Vietnam's first great tragedies. The story centers on the king's daughter, Mai Chau, and a young man named Trong Thuy, son of Giao Tuo, the ambitious ruler known in Vietnamese memory as Trio Da. He entered the court, gained her trust, learned the secret of the crossbow, and passed it on to his father. Love and espionage became tangled. The kingdom fell. There is a reason this tale endured. It is not just about a daughter who loved unwisely. It is about the cost of innocence when facing a patient foreign rival. Mai Chau is remembered with pity as much as blame. She trusted the private world of affection at the exact moment when the public world of politics was sharpening its knife. In later tellings, when the truth becomes clear, and Duong Vuong kills her and rides toward the sea with the golden turtle spirit, Trong Thuy, finding what remains, is overcome by grief and throws himself into a well. Pearls are said to have formed where her blood touched the sea. The details are soft with sorrow, but the lesson is hard. A nation may be conquered as much through intimacy as through battle. That warning will return again and again in Vietnamese history, in different clothes, in different centuries. Historically, the end of Olak seems tied to the expansion of Giao Tuo's realm, a polity stretching across parts of what is now southern China and northern Vietnam. Yet even under that control, the local population did not dissolve into its conqueror. That, too, becomes a pattern. Vietnam bends and is absorbs, is adapts, but does not vanish. The larger and more consequential conquest came in 111 BCE, when the Han Empire moved decisively south. Emperor Wu sent armies that overwhelmed the region and brought it under direct imperial administration. What followed was not a brief occupation, but the beginning of nearly a millennium of Chinese political domination, interrupted by rebellion, negotiated through daily compromise, and remembered forever as both a wound and a school. The Han did not rule vaguely. They ruled bureaucratically. The land was divided into commanderies and prefectures. Officials were appointed. Reports were filed. Taxes were assessed. Roads and administrative centers were established. Chinese imperial governance had confidence in writing, categories, and ritual. It liked a thing named measured and fitted into a hierarchy. Vietnam became, in their view, a southern frontier to be managed, civilized, and folded into a wider imperial order. Chinese officials arrived carrying scrolls, legal concepts, literary habits, and assumptions about cultural superiority. Confucian texts became pathways to official advancement. Vietnamese elites, if they wanted influence within the imperial framework, had to study them. Language shifted in administration. Clothing styles changed. Hair and ritual practices came under regulation. Architecture in some urban centers adopted Chinese forms. The imperial project was not content with collecting taxes. It sought to reshape society. And still, beneath all this, village life continued with remarkable stubbornness. This is one of the great themes of Vietnamese history: the split between the visible layer of rule and the deeper layer of lived continuity. An administrator may sit in a district office with imported texts and polished seals, but a village still wakes to water buffalo, ancestor offerings, local spirits, ariche calendars, and kinship ties older than the office itself. You can impose a system from above. It is much harder to persuade the soil. Archaeology gives us little flashes of that quiet resistance. Burials mixing imported Chinese items with local symbols. Pottery that keeps distinctive patterns. Foodways that remain rooted in local habit. Women continuing to hold important economic roles, even as Confucian ideology tried to narrow the acceptable shape of their lives. Some scholars argue that indigenous social practices, including traces of older matrilineal structures, persisted far more strongly than official Chinese narratives would admit. The Chinese occupation changed Vietnam deeply. Of course, it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. Bureaucratic techniques, writing systems, administrative vocabulary, agricultural technologies, and philosophical traditions all left marks that endured. Improved irrigation and metal tools increased productivity. Astronomical and mathematical knowledge sharpened timing and record keeping. The occupiers brought instruments of control, but some of those same instruments later became tools in Vietnamese hands. That paradox is central. Vietnam learned from empire without consenting to become it. Another major current arrived during this long era: Buddhism. Coming by sea from India and through wider regional exchange, Buddhist teachings took root in northern Vietnam by around the 2nd century CE, at places like Lui Lao, an important early center. Buddhist ideas met local spiritual practice, older animist traditions, and imported Chinese thought. The result was not replacement, but layering. A peasant might honor ancestors, fear village spirits, visit a Buddhist site for protection, and live under Confucian administration all at once. Human beings are very capable of keeping multiple shelves in the same cabinet, especially when survival depends on it. I have always liked that about Vietnam's religious history. It feels less like a clean doctrinal march and more like a house gradually filling with useful lights. One lamp from India, one from China, one from the village grove, one from the family altar, none fully extinguishing the others. By the 5th century, there was already a hybrid elite emerging, Vietnamese in ancestry and local attachment, Chinese in education and administrative fluency. These scholar officials lived in two worlds. They knew the imperial language of order, yet also understood the rhythms of village society beneath it. In time, such figures would become crucial because they learned how to use Chinese political concepts to argue for distinctly Vietnamese ends. A tool borrowed is not a soul surrendered. Yet we should not let the long view become too calm. Chinese records themselves note repeated uprisings. There were dozens across the centuries, perhaps 50 significant rebellions or more. Some were local and brief. Others grew wide enough to rattle the confidence of officials. Each one was suppressed. Each one also made the same point. The conquered had not accepted the story the conqueror told about them. In a village under Han rule, the experience of empire might have felt less like grand civilizational exchange and more like a series of irritations growing heavier each year. New levies, new obligations, new rules about who may wear what, who may inherit what, who may speak in what form to whom. A husband summoned or punished. A local elder humiliated by an outsider half his age but armed with imperial authority. The sort of pressure that accumulates like standing water behind a dike. You know that feeling when a room keeps growing warmer, and no one says anything, but everyone senses that something is wrong. That was the occupation at its most dangerous. Not the spectacle of empire at parade height, but the daily pressure that invites a sudden answer. And somewhere within that tightening world, memory did its work. The people of the Delta still remembered older kingdoms, older ancestors, old stories that named them before the empire named them. The dragon and fairy had not been forgotten, nor had the idea that the people of these rivers belonged to one another first. So when the time came for revolt, it did not emerge from nowhere. It rose from grief, resentment, memory, and the stubborn knowledge that occupation, however long, is still occupation. Soon, two sisters will turn private mourning into public war. They will mount elephants, gather tens of thousands, and remind the empire that the South has never been as obedient as Northern records prefer to imagine. For now, though, let the torchlight dim around Koloa. Let the packed earth walls hold their silence. Let the old crossbow rest in legend, beyond the ramparts. Foreign rule has begun settling in with the heavy confidence of a long season. But underneath it, the ground is not still. It is waiting. And perhaps that is the strangest comfort in this early chapter. Defeat comes. Yes. Walls fail. Kingdoms fall. Stories darken. But the people beneath the story do not disappear. They marry, plant, bury, pray, whisper, remember. They learn the language of the ruler and keep their own meanings hidden inside it. They bow when needed and mutter other truths at home. It is not glamorous resistance. No poet gets rich describing a woman washing rice while refusing inwardly to become someone else. Yet that, too, is how a civilization survives long occupations. Not only by battle, but by refusing to forget itself in ordinary hours. And those ordinary hours are about to break open. The answer arrived in the year 40 CE, and it arrived with grief, wearing armor. A Chinese official had executed the husband of Trung Trak, a local noblewoman whose family already carried resentment toward Han rule. His death was not merely a private cruelty. It was one more insult in a long campaign of pressure, taxation, and cultural humiliation. Sometimes, an empire imagines that one punishment will quiet a province. Instead, it discovers that sorrow, if struck in the wrong place, becomes a banner. Trung Trak did not rise alone. Beside her stood her sister, Chung Ni. Together they gathered support with astonishing speed. Local aristocrats joined them. Villagers joined them. Fighters came in such numbers that later tradition spoke of tens of thousands, even 80,000, though ancient numbers often swell like rivers in monsoon season. What matters most is not the exact count, but the force of the response. The sisters touch something already burning beneath the surface. In later memory, they ride war elephants, and it is hard to think of a more unforgettable image. Elephant hide dark with sweat, harness straps creaking, drums sounding, spears upright in the mist. Two women at the head of a rising host, not asking permission from history, then but stepping straight into it. Chinese officials who had thought themselves masters of a manageable southern frontier suddenly found cities falling around them. Within months, the Trung movement seized dozens of strongholds, perhaps 65, according to tradition. Administrative centers changed hands. Han officers fled or were driven out. Trung Trak was proclaimed queen, not a symbolic widow installed for comfort, but a sovereign. Her court was set at Mi Lin, not in a foreign style, capital meant to imitate the empire, but in her own native place. That choice mattered. It said that legitimacy could rise from local ground for a brief span, perhaps 3 years. An independent Vietnamese state stood again. For two sisters from the south, to force the Han backward was humiliating to that machine in a way the official records could not entirely hide. Even the Chinese histories, usually stingy with respect for those they called barbarians, gave this uprising unusual attention. and the gender of the leaders made the challenge sharper still. Han rule carried Confucian assumptions about hierarchy and masculine authority. A revolt led by women embarrassed the empire in a special way. But empires do not let go simply because the conquered are brave. Emperor Guangwu of the Eastern Han sent experienced forces south under the veteran general Ma Yuan. The counterattack was patient and crushing. The Han army had better equipment, greater depth of supply, and the institutional discipline of a state accustomed to long war. Bit by bit, they pushed the resistance back. This is where the story turns from triumph into a softer, more painful light. We do not have every tactical detail. Time has taken them. But tradition remembers the end clearly enough. Faced with defeat, unwilling to be captured, the Trung sisters threw themselves into the Hat River. It is one of those endings that history may polish and reshape, yet its emotional truth survives whatever exact form it once had. They chose death over display in the parade of the conqueror. They became inseparable from the idea that dignity may outlive victory. The rebellion failed in immediate terms. Chinese rule returned. The taxes did not vanish. The uniforms and regulations did not blow away like ash. Yet failure is not always final in the way conquerors hope. The Trung sisters entered Vietnamese memory with a force far beyond the short duration of their rule. Temples rose in their honor. Ritual observances marked the anniversaries of their deaths. During later centuries of occupation, people visited shrines to remember that resistance had once succeeded, if only briefly, and could do so again. In Hanoi and beyond, their names became less like names and more like a kind of inheritance. Their example also established something unusual within East Asian history, a distinctly Vietnamese tradition of women as military and political resistors. Later figures would be measured against them. Lady Trio, for example, entered memory through the same fierce lineage. Tradition gives her words of startling grandeur. She would rather ride the storm and cut through great waves than bow her head and become someone else's servant. Whether every syllable is exact matters less than the fact that Vietnam kept wanting such women and kept remembering them. So the long occupation continued, but not passively. Rebellions flickered again and again across the centuries. Some local, some large, none decisive enough to end Chinese rule for good. Yet each one carried forward the same habit of refusal. And beneath the visible order of occupation, a cultural mixture continued to deepen. Vietnam absorbed Chinese administrative forms, literary habits, and philosophical language. At the same time, it kept village structures, local worship, and a memory of separateness. The result was not purity, which history almost never grants, but endurance. Nearly 900 years after the Trung sisters, the chance for a break finally returned. By the early 10th century, Tang power in China had weakened badly. Imperial authority frayed. Warlords rose. Peripheral zones became unstable. For Vietnam, this kind of northern collapse had happened before, but never in a way that opened the door quite so clearly. The man who stepped through that door was no queen. He had watched events to the north with a soldier eye. Tang collapse had produced successor states, among them the Southern Han, whose rulers looked southward and imagined the Vietnamese lands could be reclaimed fully, while the moment favored them. No Quyen prepared for war, and his genius was not to meet the invader in the most obvious way. He looked instead at the Bach Dang River. Rivers in Vietnam are never just scenery. They are roads, traps, granaries, boundaries, mothers, enemies, and in the hands of a good commander, weapons. He studied the tides. This detail matters because it reveals a style of warfare that appears again and again in Vietnam's long struggle with stronger opponents. The country does not defeat larger powers by pretending size is irrelevant. It defeats them by making size awkward, by turning climate, water, mud, distance, disease, and timing into allies, by forcing the invader to fight the land as much as the army. At low tide, No Quyen ordered iron-tipped wooden stakes driven deep into the riverbed. They were positioned where the enemy fleet, advancing at high water, would not see them. Then Vietnamese forces lured the Southern Han ships inward at the right moment. When the tide began to fall, the trap revealed itself. Large warships became snagged, pierced, immobilized. In that confusion, Vietnamese forces struck with ferocity. Imagine the scene. The tide slipping away. Oars suddenly useless. Hulls groaning. Men shouting to each other over widening panic. The neat certainty of naval advance turning, minute by minute, into a floating disaster. Then the ambush. From banks, boats, hidden positions, all converging once the river had done its work. The Southern Han commander was killed. The fleet was destroyed. The year was 938, and Vietnam had won not just a battle, but a psychological revolution. After generations in which resistance had so often ended in renewed submission, the myth of Chinese inevitability cracked. Ngo Quyen declared himself king and established his capital at Ko Loa, reaching deliberately back toward the ancient kingdom of Olak. He was not merely founding a new regime. He was stitching the present to the deepest remembered past. The message was simple. Vietnam was not some accidental frontier breaking loose. It was returning to itself. His reign was short, only 6 years. But length is not the only measure of greatness. Some rulers occupy a throne for decades and leave only dust. Others strike one necessary blow and alter the path of centuries. Ngo Quyen belongs firmly to the second group. The pattern he established also echoed forward. The Bach Dang trap would be used again by later Vietnamese leaders, with stunning success each time. The river had entered the military imagination of the nation. Hidden stakes, receding tide, overconfident invader, sudden reversal. Still, a victory does not instantly create stable government. After Ngo Quyen's death, the land slipped into conflict among regional powers, remembered as the era of the 12 warlords. Authority fractured. Men with local armies and personal ambitions carved influence from the countryside. Yet even in this disorder, one thing had changed irreversibly. The idea of Vietnamese self-rule was no longer myth or brief rebellion. It had happened. It could happen again. Eventually, unification came under Dinh Bo Linh, who subdued the warlords and founded a more coherent state in the late 10th century. He took the imperial title and renamed the realm Dai Co Viet. Courts became more regular, offices more defined. Punishments, according to some accounts, could be impressively severe. Medieval rulers were rarely soft. After the Dinh came Le Hoan, who faced renewed pressure from the Song dynasty and preserved independence again. Statehood in Vietnam was never allowed to grow sleepy for long. The North remained powerful, watchful, and periodically tempted. Yet the pattern was strengthening. Vietnam now had kings of its own, capitals of its own, armies of its own, and a memory of successful resistance no foreign chronicle could erase. The deeper transformation came in 1009, when Li Kong Wan ascended the throne, taking the name Li Tai Tu and founding the Li dynasty. Here, the story turns from mere survival toward civilization in fuller bloom. The earlier strongholds, especially Hoa Lu, had been chosen largely for defense. Mountains, narrow approaches, difficult terrain, understandable choices in dangerous times. But Lai Tai too wanted something else for the future. He moved the capital to a promising stretch along the Red River and named it Thang Long, Ascending Dragon, the city that would one day become Hanoi. It was a magnificent act of confidence. His proclamation described the capital as the place where heaven and earth meet, where the four directions converge, where the dynasty might endure for 10,000 generations. This was more than royal poetry. It was a shift in political imagination. Vietnam would not merely hide from attack. It would organize itself around a true center, one that could sustain administration, culture, religion, education, and the long patience of a growing nation. Under the Lai, Buddhism flourished with unusual brilliance. Monks served as advisors. Temples and pagodas received support. The one pillar, pagoda, rising from water like a lotus, became one of the iconic expressions of this world, where spiritual symbolism and statecraft touched each other openly. Yet this was not a rejection of Chinese-derived institutions. Confucian learning remained important. Examinations developed. What made the Lai distinctive was their balance. They used what China had transmitted, but infused it with something gentler and more locally shaped. One king reportedly said he would rather spare a guilty person than kill an innocent one. Whether or not every ruler lived up to such ideals is another matter. Governments are usually less saintly in practice than in inscription. Still, the sentiment mattered. The Lai also invested directly in infrastructure. Dikes along the Red River were strengthened and extended. Wet rice agriculture expanded. Rulers personally inspected works during the rainy season. Nation building was never only a matter of palaces and rites. It was dikes, canals, embankments, flood control, and the annual argument with water. A kingdom that neglects its rivers in Vietnam does not remain a kingdom for long. The Temple of Literature was founded in this period, marking the rise of higher learning in a formally recognized way. Yet even where Chinese influence is visible, the decorative and spiritual language remained mixed, with local motifs and Buddhist touches sharing space with Confucian seriousness. Vietnam was becoming unmistakably itself through selective borrowing, not imitation. As the Lai centuries unfolded, Vietnam grew steadier, richer, more administratively capable. A distinct civilization was taking clearer shape. But confidence always attracts a test, and in the 13th century, that test arrived from the greatest land empire the world had ever seen. The Mongols were coming. They had broken kingdoms and empires from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Cities with stronger walls than anything in Vietnam had fallen to them. Open field armies had been shattered. When they turned toward Dai Viet, few outsiders would have wagered much on the small kingdom in the humid south. Yet Cize, once again, was about to become awkward. The story will now move into one of the grandest achievements in Vietnamese history. Not one victory, but three. And on the same Bach Dang waters, where No Quyen once taught a river how to kill, another commander will prepare to do it again. The throne had passed from the Lai to the Tran in 1225 through careful family maneuvering, the sort of elegant political replacement that historians describe in tidy language and the participants probably experienced as a very tense series of smiles. The new dynasty kept power close within the ruling family, distributing authority among relatives while preserving the emperor at the center. It was a practical arrangement for dangerous times, and dangerous times arrived quickly. By the middle of the 13th century, Mongol power had become the great fact of Eurasia. Armies under the descendants of Genghis Khan had rolled across northern China, Korea, Central Asia, Persia, and deep into Europe. Their empires stretched like a storm line across the world. In open country, their cavalry was devastating. They moved fast, coordinated well, and struck with a confidence born from repeated success. When such a machine turned toward Dai Viet, the likely outcome seemed obvious to anyone who thought geography was just a background detail. Vietnam, fortunately for itself, did not share that opinion. The first invasion came in 1257. Mongol forces advanced and captured Thang Long. The Tran court withdrew. To a superficial observer, this might have looked like defeat in familiar form. Capital lost. Court scattered. Invader triumphant. But the Vietnamese response was never built around defending prestige for its own sake. Cities could be abandoned. Crops could be removed or destroyed. Wells could be poisoned. Let the invader take a capital stripped of what he needs, and he has taken a shell. This was the scorched earth logic that would define Vietnamese resistance more than once. Painful, yes. Hard on its own population, certainly. But against an enemy used to living off conquered territory, it was cruelly effective. The Mongols found the climate hostile, the food scarce, and the environment far less obedient than the plains, where their cavalry excelled. Horses weakened, supply lines strained, disease crept through camps. The heat and moisture worked quietly, the way they always do, without fanfare and without mercy. Within months, the invaders were forced to withdraw. They had inflicted damage, but they had not secured submission. The second invasion, in 1284 and 1285, brought a more serious test and the emergence of the commander who would become one of the greatest figures in Vietnamese history, Tran Hung Dao, pranks, general, strategist, and later near saint of the national memory. He understood something essential. The Mongols had to be fought asymmetrically. A smaller kingdom that tried to meet them according to their preferred logic would be helping them. So he refused to cooperate with their preferences. Cities were again yielded when necessary. Supplies were removed. The enemy was drawn into difficult ground, dense forests, swamps, floodplains, and rice landscapes where cavalry maneuver became clumsy. Vietnamese forces struck in swift attacks and then dissolved back into terrain the invader never fully mastered. This was not the kind of warfare that flatters an empire. It denies clean victory. It stretches confidence until it frays. The climate made everything worse for the invaders. Tropical disease does not care how many kingdoms a man has already conquered. Malaria, damp, spoiled grain, fever, insects, rotting equipment, all the ordinary humiliations of campaigning in Southeast Asia wore down Mongol effectiveness. Their famous bows suffered in the humidity. Their horses lost some of the advantages that made them terrible elsewhere. The final invasion came in 1287 and 1288 under the authority of Kublai Khan, and it was the most ambitious of the three. A massive force moved against Dai Viet, supported by fleets. The Mongols and their allies meant this time to finish the matter properly. They had numbers, prestige, resources, and the stubborn inability of great empires to admit that a small farming kingdom might simply refuse to be digested. Tran Hung Dao prepared his answer. He is remembered not just as a tactician, but as a thinker of war. He understood morale, diren, timing, and the importance of binding elite and commoner into one defensive effort. He urged unity. He reminded nobles and soldiers alike that a divided country would perish. He knew Vietnam could not beat the Mongols by wealth, nor by sheer mass, nor by glory in open battle. It could beat them only by making every river, swamp, village, and season part of the defense. The campaign developed as a long struggle of movement and attrition, but all of it bent toward a familiar place: Bach Dang. There is something almost theatrical about history returning to the same river for the same lesson. Yet this was not mere repetition. It was refinement. Tran Hung Dao understood the tides, the channels, the needs of a pursuing fleet, as no Quyen had done centuries earlier. He had stakes planted in the riverbed at low tide, iron tipped and positioned with careful calculation. They waited, hidden beneath the water. The Vietnamese then drew the enemy fleet inward. At high tide, the ships could move. At low tide, they became victims. When the water retreated, the trap came alive. Vessels grounded, split, or jammed against the stake field. Order collapsed into confusion. And then the Vietnamese struck with fire, arrows, boarding attacks, and assaults from multiple directions. What had looked like pursuit turned into disaster. The Mongol commander, Omar, was captured. The fleet was wrecked. The invasion collapsed. It is difficult to overstate how extraordinary that is. Across Eurasia, whole civilizations had buckled before the Mongols. Yet Vietnam defeated them 3 times, and in the last encounter, shattered the illusion that the empire could simply keep trying until the smaller state ran out of nerve. The Vietnamese had run the invader into the land, into the climate, into hunger, into miscalculation, and finally into sharpened wood, waiting under brown water. But the Tran period was not just war. That matters too, because a nation cannot live forever on battlefield memory alone. However glorious, the dynasty also strengthened internal life. One notable policy was a kind of revolving land distribution meant to prevent excessive aristocratic concentration. Examinations included practical subjects in addition to classical learning. Governance retained a balance between family power and central authority. Spiritually, the Tran period also gave rise to something distinctly Vietnamese. Emperor Tran Nhan Tong later abdicated and founded the Truc Lam Zen school, a native Buddhist tradition drawing from earlier influences, but shaped on Vietnamese soil. This is a lovely detail in the middle of a martial age. A dynasty famous for defeating the Mongols also produced a king who became a monk and helped form a domestic school of Buddhism. Vietnam has always had that doubleness. Steel and incense, dikes and poems, elephants and sutras. Yet no dynasty remains at its best forever. Success breeds luxury. Luxury invites carelessness. By the late 14th century, the Tran order had decayed. Corruption spread. Court intrigue deepened. Institutions weakened. The old systems that had kept wealth from concentrating began to fail. The state looked intact from a distance, but the joints were loosening. Into that uncertainty stepped Ho Quai Lai. He was a high official with formidable ambition. And unlike many ambitious officials, he also had ideas. A dangerous combination, especially for everyone around him. In 1400, he forced the last Tran ruler aside and established a new dynasty. What followed was one of the most radical reform experiments in Vietnamese history. From a modern distance, some of his measures look startlingly forward-thinking. He reduced the power of Buddhist institutions and redirected wealth toward the state. He imposed land reforms, limiting aristocratic holdings and redistributing excess. He introduced paper currency with all the confidence of a man who assumed people would accept paper because he had announced that they should. He established state monopolies on important goods. He even expanded education beyond the old elite patterns and inserted mathematics into examinations. That alone probably ruined the week of a great many self-satisfied scholars. Most strikingly, he promoted the use of Nam, the adapted script used to write Vietnamese, and translated classical works into it. This mattered enormously. Language is not only communication, it is political gravity. To elevate the written vernacular is to say that a people may think in their own voice. But reform from above is rarely greeted with universal gratitude. Buddhist monks resented the assault on their status and resources. Landlords hated confiscation. Merchants disliked tighter regulation. Many Confucian scholars saw the changes as vulgar and destabilizing. Common people, meanwhile, found paper money confusing and easy to distrust. Ho Kui Li may have been ahead of his time in some respects, but being ahead of time has a dreadful tendency to produce enemies in the present. When the new regime transferred authority, the Ming court seized the opening. Publicly, it claimed to be restoring the Tran. In practice, it aimed at direct conquest. The invasion came in 1407, and the divided, unsettled state could not resist effectively. Ho Kuai Li and his son were captured and sent away to die in exile. The Ming did not intend merely to supervise. They intended to absorb and erase. Vietnam was reorganized as a Chinese province. Administrative districts were imposed directly. Precious Vietnamese texts were confiscated and carried north. More than 10,000 books, according to some accounts. Clothing, hairstyles, and customs were regulated again. Skilled craftsmen, scholars, artists, and laborers were taken away to serve imperial needs. Bronze casters were especially valued, a grim complement to the old metal-working traditions of the land. Women were drawn into exploitative labor. Others were sent away as workers and soldiers. Most devastating of all, for the deeper cultural life of the country, the use of Nam was suppressed. Chinese was enforced for official writing, and native texts were destroyed. This was not only political domination, it was an attack on memory. Yet this brutality created the very unity the Ming had failed to anticipate. Groups that might otherwise have remained suspicious of one another now shared a common injury. Cultural destruction became a forge. In 1418, in the highlands of Dan Hoa, a landholder named Le Loi gathered a tiny corps of followers at Lam Son. Just 27 men at the beginning. Tradition says a small number, almost absurdly small, against the Ming machine. But revolutions often begin with a handful of people willing to go hungry together. Le Loi did not seek immediate grand battle. He built patiently. Bases in remote terrain. Local support in the countryside. Raids on supply lines. Attacks on isolated posts. Avoidance of major confrontations while strength grew. This was war conducted with an intimate understanding of what the land could offer and what the occupier could not endure. Ming armies were built for conventional campaigns. They found themselves instead chasing enemies through forest, mountain passes, mud, and monsoon fatigue. Vietnamese fighters dispersed when pressed, regrouped elsewhere, and struck again. The geography became an ally. So did disease, exhaustion, and the thinning patience of garrisons forced to defend too much with too little certainty. Le Loi, great partner in this movement, was Nguyen Trai, scholar, strategist, and one of the finest political writers in Vietnamese history. He understood that liberation required more than successful ambushes. It required moral language. His proclamations did not speak only to Vietnamese supporters. They also addressed the occupiers and the wider logic of legitimacy. In the famous declaration composed after victory, he asserted that the southern land had long possessed its own sovereignty, customs, mountains, rivers, and rulers. This was not merely dynastic complaint. It was an articulation of nationhood. By 1426, the balance had shifted decisively. Vietnamese victories multiplied. Ming reinforcements suffered badly. Support for Le Loi surged. At places like Chi Lang, invading forces were mauled. Finally, the Ming agreed to negotiate withdrawal. In 1428, Le Loi took the throne as Le Daito, founder of the later Le dynasty. The occupation ended. Vietnamese books, language, and political life did not all return untouched. Nothing returns untouched after such years. But the country had survived the attempt to erase it. The later Le would go on to build a strong bureaucracy, revive examinations, codify law, and shape Vietnamese society profoundly. Confucianism would become more dominant under their rule. Nam would persist in literary life. Women would see some rights protected in law even as patriarchal norms tightened overall. The state grew more sophisticated, more centralized, and more self-consciously Vietnamese. As the later L'Age unfolds, Vietnam will grow stronger, more ordered, more ambitious. It will march south. It will divide internally. It will reunify again in fire. But the emotional center of so much that follows is already here. Farmers, scholars, monks, local nobles, river fighters, women on elephants, kings with Buddhist advisors, generals with stakes under the tide, all discovering the same stubborn fact. Empires can arrive with immense weight. They can bring armies, doctrines, paperwork, engineers, and polished certainty. Yet, in Vietnam, if they stay too long, the land begins teaching against them. The rivers keep notes. The paddies keep feeding the wrong side. The forests become conspirators. The people remember older names. And then one day, what seemed impossible begins again. The victory over the Ming did not return Vietnam to some untouched innocence. No nation walks out of occupation exactly as it entered. The smoke clears, the banners change, the songs come back, but the structure of feeling is altered. Under the later Le dynasty, especially in its strongest generations, Vietnam turned toward discipline, order, and self-conscious statecraft with unusual intensity. Le Loi had won freedom through forests, patience, and sharpened will. His successors had to turn that freedom into something durable. Roads were improved. Administrative layers were clarified. Examinations were restored and expanded. Law was written with more confidence. Rice fields were measured, taxes assessed. Officials watched, at least in theory. Vietnam was no longer simply a people surviving against great odds. It was becoming a more formalized kingdom, one that could imagine itself not only resisting history, but directing it. The reign of Lê Thánh Tông in the 15th century stands near the summit of this process. He is remembered as one of the greatest state builders in Vietnamese history, and not without reason. Under him, the court tightened its grasp on administration. The bureaucracy became more disciplined. Provincial organization was sharpened. Confucian learning rose to a place of extraordinary authority. The state examination system offered a ladder upward, even for talented men of modest birth. Though climbing that ladder still required family sacrifice, long study, and a temperament able to survive the company of other scholars, which is never easy. The Temple of Literature in Hanoi became more than a symbolic place. It was a declaration carved in stone that learning and office would be linked, that the kingdom would train its own governing class, and that moral order, as understood through the Confucian frame, would shape the rhythm of public life. Stone stelae, bearing the names of successful candidates, still stand as quiet monuments to the ambitions of generations. You can almost imagine the sound of robes brushing stone, the scratch of brushes, the long breath before a candidate lifted his eyes to see whether the examiner face held approval or ruin. This Confucian turn changed daily life in ways both subtle and severe. Family hierarchy hardened. Ancestral rites became more regulated. Public moral language grew more formal. Women retained important rights in some legal contexts, and the Hongduk Code preserved protections that look striking beside many contemporary systems. Yet the overall trend leaned toward firmer patriarchy. The doctrine of female obedience deepened its hold. A daughter was to bend to father, wife to husband, veto to son. History is often like that, one hand giving, another quietly taking away. Buddhism did not vanish. It remained beloved among ordinary people, close to the village, close to prayer, close to grief. But it no longer occupied the political center as it had under the Lai and in parts of the Tran Age. Confucian officials now shaped the idiom of governance. Scholarship moved from sutra to statecraft. Moral philosophy turned practical, administrative, almost skeletal in its neatness. The court increasingly preferred the sound of properly ordered governance to the looser music of spiritual diversity. And still, Vietnam did not become China. This is one of the great themes that repeats until it almost becomes the pulse of the story. Chinese forms were borrowed, admired, adapted, and sometimes enforced. Yet they were never simply copied into an empty room. They entered a house that already had its own weather, its own altars, its own memory of mountains and river mud and dragon ancestry. Even the script world reflected this doubleness. Classical Chinese remained the language of official seriousness, but Chu Nom, built from modified Chinese characters to fit Vietnamese speech, allowed a parallel literary life to grow. A scholar might compose his memorial in one language and his private poem in another. A state can try to speak with one voice, but a civilization usually murmurs in several. As the court strengthened in the north, the body of the country itself began to lengthen. This movement south, known later as Nam Tien, was one of the most consequential processes in Vietnamese history. It was not a single war and not a single migration. It was a long, uneven, often brutal drift of settlement, conquest, intermarriage, adaptation, and absorption stretching over centuries. At the beginning of this movement, Vietnam was concentrated in the Red River Delta, a dense northern cradle shaped by monsoon water. The case, village autonomy, and long habits of survival. To the south lay Champa, a sophisticated maritime kingdom strung along the central coast. Cham society looked toward the sea in ways northern Vietnam looked toward the river, plain. Its temples carried the imprint of Indian religion and artistic forms. Brick towers rose against the coast and hills, dedicated to deities like Shiva. Trade tied Champa outward to the wider seas of Southeast Asia and beyond. The Vietnamese did not encounter an empty frontier. They encountered a civilization. Conflict with Champa came in waves. Raids, reprisals, border pressure, larger campaigns, uneasy peace. Then renewed war. Yet not every step of Nam Tien was military. In many places, it happened through farmers. Families moved southward, established villages, drained wet ground, cut irrigation channels, planted rice, built shrines, market graves, and slowly changed the demographic weight of the land. Settlement can be quieter than conquest, but no less final. In the border zones, life became mixed and complicated. Trade continued even when courts distrusted one another. Marriages crossed the frontier. Customs blended. People learned to live in categories. Rulers preferred to keep separate. A border on a map is a clear line only to those who have never stood inside it. The great turning point came in 1471, when Le Tan Tong launched a massive campaign against Champa. The Cham capital at Vijaya was taken and shattered. The blow was devastating. Champa did not entirely disappear, but it ceased to exist as a strong, unified rival. Its territories fragmented. Vietnamese authority moved deeper into lands that had long been Cham. The cultural consequences of that conquest still live in central Vietnam. Ruined towers, local communities preserving memory, religious practices surviving in minority form, all reminders that national territory is often layered over older worlds rather than built cleanly from bare earth. As Vietnamese settlers advanced into former Cham territory, they carried with them the familiar village pattern of the north. Rice agriculture expanded. Local governance structures followed. Ancestor halls appeared. Confucian family ideals traveled south with hoes and buffalo and wedding gifts. Yet the South also changed the settlers. New climates, coastlines, and neighbors meant new forms of living. Vietnam was extending itself, but extension always stretches identity as well. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the movement had reached farther still, into the Mekong Delta, lands long associated with the Khmer sphere. Here the geography changed again. The delta was broad, wet, fertile, and difficult, full of water channels and swampy abundance. Vietnamese settlers drained, dug, built, and planted until the region became one of the richest rice-producing zones in the country. The transformation was enormous, and for the peoples already there, it was not a neutral development. Highland groups, Cham communities, Khmer population, all found themselves living inside a new political and cultural pressure system. This is one of the places where national history grows morally thorny. Vietnamese memory often celebrates Nam Tien as an epic of endurance and growth. And certainly it was that. But for those absorbed, displaced, or marginalized by the process, it could look less like destiny and more like the slow arrival of someone else's certainty. History rarely offers a clean roll. The descendant of the conquered may later become the conqueror. While the country stretched southward, its political center did not remain calm. By the 17th century, Vietnam entered one of its strangest long seasons. The great division between the Trinh lords in the north and the Nguyen lords in the south. The official fiction was that both served the Le Emperor. The practical reality was that the emperor had become little more than a ceremonial lantern left glowing while other men handled the house. The dividing line hardened around the John River. North and South did not become fully separate countries, yet they developed in different directions over generations. The Trinh held Hanoi and the northern bureaucratic heartland. They leaned toward conservative Confucian orthodoxy, tighter court ritual, stronger continuity with the older Red River political culture. The Nguyen, ruling from the south, faced outward and downward toward frontier settlement, maritime trade, and the practical demands of expansion. Between 1627 and 1672, the two sides fought a series of major wars. These campaigns devastated central regions and turned the country into a long argument made of mud walls, trenches, and exhausted peasants. The Nguyen, despite possessing less established territory at first, proved remarkably resilient. One reason was military engineering. The Dong Hoi wall system, influenced in part by Portuguese expertise, formed an impressive defensive barrier across the narrow waste of central Vietnam. Earthworks, forts, moats, controlled approaches, all blended local need with foreign technical knowledge. It is a reminder that Vietnam has often resisted outside domination while still borrowing outside skill whenever useful. Practicality is one of the country's great recurring virtues. After decades of inconclusive struggle, the division settled into a kind of armed stalemate. A long Cold War before the phrase existed. Neither side could eliminate the other. Both learned to live with suspension, yet the split changed the culture deeply. The North became denser in its old rhythms. Scholar officials, formal examinations, stricter ritual culture, and conservative governance remained its defining features. The South became more commercially open. Japanese merchants, Chinese migrants, later European traders and missionaries, all found more room there. Christian communities took root more easily. Ports thrived. Economic life felt somewhat looser, more adaptive, less enclosed by the heavy seriousness of the old northern state. Travelers sometimes describe the two realms almost as different countries. There is something haunting about this. Vietnam remained one in memory, one in dynastic imagination, one in language and broad civilization. Yet daily life could feel divided by temperament. The North looked toward inherited order. The South looked toward opportunity and movement. One polished the ancestral tablet. The other checked the tide, counted the cargo, and wondered who was landing next. Literary life flourished in both worlds, though differently. Chu Nom writing expanded. Poetry, philosophy, and local histories developed distinct regional tones. Even division could become fertile. A country under pressure often writes better than a country entirely comfortable. Misery is not good. Exactly. But it does produce paperwork and poetry in suspiciously high quantities. Still, the split came at great cost. Armies consumed grain. Taxes pressed harder on villagers. Corruption thickened in both courts. Ambitious men clustered around noble households like moths around an oil lamp, hoping for warmth and usually finding smoke. Ordinary people paid the bill. By the 18th century, resentment had accumulated across class and region. The Trin and Win had both become detached from the texture of village suffering. A government that stops hearing the peasant begins, sooner or later, to hear the peasant marching. And so, from the central lands most battered by this long division, a new force began to rise. Not from old capital stone or examination halls, but from rougher ground. 3 brothers from Taysun, men of comparatively humble origin, would gather grievance, hunger, Iwa's talent, and popular rage into a movement capable of destroying both old regimes. The world the Leh had shaped, the world stretched southward by settlers and split by rival lords, was about to catch fire from the middle. The next chapter will open with peasants, tax burdens, mountain roads, and 3 brothers who looked at 2 exhausted courts and decided the age of polite decay had lasted long enough. In such moments, history stops sounding like bronze drums and begins sounding like feet on dusty roads. Tax ledgers slammed shut, and village whispers turning bold. Vietnam had been built by patience, defended by cunning, and enlarged by relentless movement. Now it was ready to be overturned by its own children. The Tay Son Uprising began in 1771. And like many great upheavals, it started with something both practical and unbearable: taxes, corruption, and the hard knowledge that those ruling no longer felt the weight carried by those below. The three brothers from Tay-san, Nguyen Nak, Nguyen Kue, and Gwen Lu, were not born into the serene luxury of old dynastic confidence. They rose from a central region that had endured too much from the long Trin Nguyen division and from the greed of local officials who had learned how to squeeze a peasant until even complaint seemed expensive. At first, the movement struck familiar targets: corrupt tax collectors, abusive local authorities, the small, hard faces of a larger injustice. But its message expanded quickly. The existing order had failed. The people had paid and paid, and the promises from both North and South had gone sour in the mouth. Peasants joined. Discontented scholars joined. Minor officials, traders, monks, and fighters found reasons to lean toward the rising banner. Within a few years, the Tay-san had moved from insurgency to transformation. In 1773, they took Quy Hanyon and established a base. In 1777, they overthrew the southern Nguyen regime and killed most of the ruling family. The political geography of Vietnam, which had felt fixed by habit and exhaustion, suddenly became fluid. Men who had assumed their family power would go on forever discovered, with the usual historical surprise that forever can be a very short afternoon. Then came the northern turn. In 1786, Nguyen Hue led forces against the Trinh and entered Hanoi, toppling the long dominant northern lordship. For the first time in roughly a century and a half, Vietnam was effectively reunited under one force. It was a breathtaking reversal. The old dual system, with its stale formalities and hidden rot, had collapsed under pressure from a movement born in the very center it had overtaxed and neglected. Among the brothers, Nguyen Hue emerged as the extraordinary military mind. Fast, decisive, inventive, he possessed the rare ability to move an army not just across land, but through the imagination of friend and enemy alike. His campaigns had speed in them that seemed almost theatrical. He could appear where rivals did not expect him, strike before they had arranged their confidence, and turn surprise into momentum before hesitation could become defense. Loyal followers came to see him as more than a commander. There was something of destiny about him in their eyes, that dangerous and useful shine which often attends a revolutionary leader. Yet, revolutions do not become stable governments merely because their enemies were corrupt. The Tay-san faced the old problem immediately. Victory over common foes does not erase internal tensions. Nguyen Nyak, the eldest brother, proclaimed himself emperor. Territories had to be divided. Authority had to be recognized. Rival ambitions, even among brothers, began to show their edges. The movement had been wonderfully good at destroying a rotted system. Building a lasting replacement proved more difficult. Then China intervened. In 1788, the Qing emperor sent a vast army south. Reportedly, around 200,000 men, intending to restore the Laos and bring Vietnam again into obedient orbit. Qing forces moved into Hanoi, and for a moment, it seemed the fragile new order in the north might simply dissolve. Here, the story narrows to one of the most astonishing campaigns in Vietnamese history. Nguyen Hue crowned himself emperor under the name Quang Trung and prepared a counterattack. The timing was exquisite. During the Lunar New Year, when many Qing troops believed the season would bring pause and ceremonial calm, Quang Trung gathered perhaps 100,000 soldiers and marched north with astonishing speed, covering around 600 kilometers in roughly 10 days. Even writing the number feels slightly breathless. Roads, if one is generous enough to call them roads, mud, cold, villages half startled by the passing host, drums at night, messengers burning forward and back, all of it driven by urgency and the exact knowledge that delay would fatten the enemy confidence. The attacks came swiftly. At places like Ngoc Hoi and Dong Da, Vietnamese forces struck through difficult ground at odd hours, with a kind of controlled ferocity that broke the rhythm of Qing command. War elephants were used to smash formations and deepen panic. What the Qing thought was secure occupation dissolved into retreat and ruin. Within days, Quang Trung had retaken Hanoi and routed the invasion. The victory was so fast and so complete that it entered national memory almost at once as a masterpiece of military audacity. Quang Trung was not only a battlefield genius, he also carried an energetic program of reform. The Tay Son redistributed land from major owners to poorer farmers. Taxes were reduced. Trade and economic development received encouragement. Talent, at least in principle, mattered more than inherited polish. The government also promoted the use of Nam in official business, a statement that Vietnamese life could be governed in a more direct relation to Vietnamese language. The Tay Son courts also blended spiritual traditions in ways ordinary people found more natural than the rigid Confucianism of older elites. Buddhism, Taoist elements, folk, religion, practical administration, and military merit all occupied space together. The world they imagined was impatient with stale prestige. And yet, as so often happens, the movement depended heavily on its most brilliant man. In 1792, Quang Trung died at only 40. His death was catastrophic. The state he had held together with speed, intelligence, and authority suddenly lost the center of its gravity. Internal fractures widened. Opportunities opened for enemies who had spent years refusing to disappear. Chief among them was Nguyen An, the surviving member of the Southern Nguyen family. His life during these decades reads almost like a lesson in the usefulness of not dying. Hunted, displaced, cornered again and again, he fled through the South, into Siam, into unstable alliances, back into hidden coastal campaigns. He survived defeats that might have ended a less persistent man. Piece by piece, he rebuilt his prospects, drawing support from loyalists, regional allies, and foreign helpers who saw advantage in his cause. One of the most important of these allies was the French missionary Pignon de Béhain. The bishop traveled to Versailles in 1787, seeking formal French support for Queen Anne in exchange for commercial privileges and religious tolerance. The full royal agreement was never really carried out, thanks in part to the French Revolution erupting in Europe. But the effort still mattered. Pigno managed to gather military advisors, engineers, supplies, and officers who helped modernize Nguyen forces in useful ways. European artillery, fortification knowledge, and naval expertise entered the struggle not as the overwhelming hand of empire yet, but as the thin edge of influence. The future Nguyen emperor sought help from French hands in order to reclaim a Vietnamese throne. Later generations of that same dynasty would face destruction from a far more predatory France. History has a dark sense of timing. Nguyen An moved carefully. He reclaimed ground in the south. He secured bases. He turned endurance into momentum. By 1801, he had captured Hue. By 1802, his armies entered Hanoi. The Tay Son order ended, and Nguyen An proclaimed himself emperor under the name Gia Long. The name itself was symbolic, joining Gia Dinh, associated with Saigon, and Thang Long, associated with Hanoi. It was a statement of reunification, a bridge name linking South and North into one imperial claim. He also officially adopted the name Vietnam for the country, a designation of lasting consequence. It carried both heritage and consolidation. This was no longer merely Die Viet in the old sense, nor a patchwork of rival domains. It was Vietnam, a single imperial body, stretched from delta to delta. Gia Long set immediately to the work of making unity administrative, legal, and physical. The realm was divided into provinces with more standardized structures. Census work was undertaken. Taxation was regularized. The Gia Long Code blended Vietnamese practice with Confucian legal influence from China, creating a system meant to bind the kingdom more tightly. Infrastructure expanded under his direction. The Great North-South Mandarin Road linked Hanoi to Saigon. Canal systems transformed movement and irrigation, especially in the Mekong Delta. Troops, goods, officials, and information could move more efficiently across a land that had spent too many generations half united in theory and divided in practice. Such works required immense labor, and not always cheerful labor. Empires, even domestic ones, are built from the backs of those who are rarely consulted. Still, the systems endured and helped knit the long, narrow country together. The most visible monument of the new dynasty was Hue. Construction of the imperial city began in 1804 and would continue for decades. Modeled in some respects on Beijing's own grand imperial design, Hue nonetheless remained profoundly local in its siting and symbolism. The Perfume River flowed before it. Mountains stood behind. Walls, moats, pavilions, palaces, temples, gates, all set according to geomantic logic and dynastic ambition. It was not a hidden capital tucked into defensive hills like older seats of uncertainty. It was a proclamation in brick, timber, and water that Vietnam possessed an empire of its own. Walking through Hue, one imagines lacquer gleaming in lamplight, silk sleeves brushing polished wood, and mandarins moving through courtyards where every stone had been asked to mean something. Yet imperial beauty always carries a whisper. Someone dug the moat. Someone hauled the bricks. Jia Long also understood the necessity of diplomacy. He sought recognition from the Qing court and received it, reinforcing Vietnamese sovereignty through the very scenic framework his kingdom had long both resisted and adapted. This too was typical Vietnam. Independence did not always mean theatrical refusal. Sometimes it meant accepting the forms of tribute diplomacy while retaining actual control on the ground. Pride can survive quite comfortably inside strategic politeness. But if Jia Long represented consolidation, his successors increasingly embodied a more rigid conservatism. Ming Mang, who followed him, intensified Confucian orthodoxy and viewed Western influence with deep suspicion. Catholic missionaries, tolerated or useful in one political season, now seemed dangerous in another. Trade contact with European powers was handled warily. The court sought to preserve moral and political order by limiting foreign intrusion. From one angle, this is understandable. The state had only recently reunified. Foreign religion carried foreign allegiance. European traders rarely arrived innocent of larger appetite. To close doors seemed prudent. From another angle, it was fatal. The 19th century was an age in which industrial powers crossed oceans with steam, artillery, and the insulting confidence of men who believed commerce and conquest were cousins. Vietnam was trying to protect itself with older tools while the shape of imperial threat was changing. Still, inside the country, life continued with its layered complexity. Villages maintained ancestral rites. Scholar officials pursued examinations and office. Farmers followed water schedules and weather signs. In the South, commercial activity and mixed populations gave the region a somewhat different tone than the old Red River world. The kingdom was unified, yes, but not uniform. It is tempting to imagine that once Jia Long had reunited the country, the great struggle was over, that Vietnam had at last found a durable resting shape. But history was already gathering another storm over the horizon. French interest in Asia was sharpening. Missionary incidents provided convenient moral theater. Commercial ambitions lurked beneath pious language. The ports of Vietnam, the routes towards southern China, the resources of the land, all had begun to draw the hungry attention of Europe. The Wien court would soon face an enemy unlike the old northern dynasties. France would arrive with industrial firepower, global naval logistics, and an imperial logic that cared less about shared civilization than about extraction, prestige, and strategic leverage. So the story pauses in a quiet room before the knock at the gate. The kingdom is whole. Hue gleams. The road runs long from north to south. Rice moves through the deltas. Officials bow in proper sequence. Ancestors are fed with incense smoke. In the court, men argue about morality, religion, and reform under painted beams. In distant pores, Europeans watch and wait. The old dragon kingdom has survived empires, divided itself, reunited, and named itself anew. Now, a different kind of empire is coming by sea, with guns that speak from farther away, and with treaties that smile before they bite. By the time France moved decisively against Vietnam in the 19th century, the Nguyen dynasty was already carrying the burden of contradiction. It wanted strength, order, and continuity. It wanted moral clarity in a world that had become morally slippery. It wanted to preserve Vietnamese sovereignty by tightening the court, disciplining the realm, and restricting dangerous foreign influence. These impulses were not foolish. They were understandable. But they were not enough. The first major French assault came in 1858 at Da Nang. The language of intervention was dressed in the usual respectable clothes: concern for persecuted Catholics, defense of mission interests, protection of civilized principles. Empires are often most theatrical when they are least honest. Beneath the piety stood harsher motives: ports, markets, prestige, naval food halls, and the wider hunger of an industrial power seeking advantage in Asia. From Da Nang, the pressure moved south. Saigon fell in 1859. Over the following years, France carved out Cochinchina as a direct colonial possession. This was not merely a military occupation. It was a careful reordering of land, labor, and authority. Steamships, artillery, trained expeditionary forces, and diplomatic opportunism all worked together. Cambodia was drawn into French control as a protectorate, isolating Vietnam further. The old kingdom, long shaped by river mud, village loyalty, and court ritual, found itself facing a machine powered by coal, industry, and imperial bureaucracy. Emperor to Duke, ruling through much of this crisis, embodied the tragedy of the moment. He was learned, reflective, even poetic. But poetry is a poor shield against naval guns. His court divided between those who urged adaptation and those who believed Western ways were poison that must be refused absolutely. In the end, the regime leaned too heavily toward preservation through denial. Reform came too late, too unevenly, and without the force needed to remake the military balance. Province after province slipped from effective control. The treaties that followed carried the formal language of agreement and the substance of coercion. The Treaty of Saigon in 1874 opened northern trade routes and deepened French leverage. The Treaty of Hue in 1883, signed after brutal pressure, turned northern and central Vietnam into protectorates. Sovereignty remained in ceremony, but less and less in fact. The Nguyen court still existed, yet its power now moved inside narrowing walls. There was resistance. Of course, there is nearly always resistance in Vietnam, sometimes open, sometimes buried so deep it must wait years before it can breathe. In 1885, after French dominance over the court had sharpened, Emperor Ham Nghi fled, and the Can Vuong movement rose in his name. Scholars, local officials, village notables, and fighters gathered under the old loyalist call to aid the king and expel the foreigners. Guerrilla bases appeared in remote zones. Ambushes struck garrisons. The struggle had the fierce sincerity of a country trying once more to turn fidelity into freedom. The French answered with harsh method. Villages suspected of support were burned. Crops were destroyed. Civilians were punished. Men were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. By the end of the century, most major Khan Vuong leaders had been captured or crushed. Yet even in defeat, the movement mattered. It preserved a moral line between ruler and occupier, between loyalty and submission, and it showed that anti-colonial feeling could move through scholar networks, rural society, and inherited political language all at once. Colonial rule transformed the country with cold efficiency. Vietnam was split administratively into 3 regions: Cochinchina in the south, under direct colonial rule, Annam in the center, and Tonkin in the north under protectorate arrangements. Fragmentation was policy. A divided country is harder to unify and revolt. Different legal structures, different administrative habits, different systems of privilege, all encouraged the sense that one land could be made to behave like 3. Economic extraction followed. Land was seized for plantations producing rubber, tea, and coffee. Peasants were pulled into cash crop systems and tax regimes that left little room for old village balance. Monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium brought revenue to colonial coffers and misery to ordinary people. Railways and roads appeared, but they served mines, ports, plantations, and troop movement before they served Vietnamese dignity. Cities like Hanoi and Saigon were dressed in French boulevards, villas, and official buildings, elegant on the surface. Though elegance can be a very efficient way to display inequality. And still the story was not only one of suffering. Colonial schools, intended to create useful intermediaries, helped produce a new generation of Vietnamese intellectuals able to read the language of the occupier and turn it back against empire. Print culture widened. New political ideas circulated. Nationalism, reformism, constitutionalism, and socialism all found readers and arguers. The colonial city, for all its segregation and insult, became a place where new forms of resistance could be imagined. One of the young Vietnamese men shaped by this whirl was born in 1,890 inches, Central Vietnam. His birth name was Nguyen Sinh Cong. History would come to know him as Ho Chi Minh. His early life contained the sharp lessons colonialism gave to those paying attention. In 1911, he left Vietnam and began years of travel and work abroad. He was a ship worker, a cook, a labouré, an observer moving through ports and cities across Africa, America, and Europe. These journeys mattered not just because they widened his view, but because they taught him that empire was not a local accident. It was a system. Its flags changed. Its habits did not. By 1917, he was in Paris, the imperial capital of the very power ruling his homeland. There, he worked modest jobs and entered circles of debate and radical politics. In 1919, using the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, he tried to place Vietnamese demands for self-determination before the Versailles Peace Conference. Woodrow Wilson language about national self-determination had stirred hopes across colonized worlds. The petition was ignored. It was one of those quietly crushing moments that changed the direction of a life. Western democratic ideals, he learned, were not designed with colonized Asians in mind. From there, he moved more decisively toward revolutionary socialism. He joined the French Communist Party and later traveled to Moscow and China, studying organization, ideology, and anti-colonial strategy. He was not a mere copyist of European theory. He was trying to solve a Vietnamese problem with whatever tools seemed sharpest. Patriotism remained central. Marxism offered a structure, discipline, and global vocabulary for liberation. In 1930, he helped organize the merger of rival communist factions into the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Its program combined national independence with social transformation, the overthrow of French rule, redistribution of land, rights for workers, and a new political future rooted among peasants and laborers as much as among educated elites. This set the movement apart from other nationalist groups, some of which sought independence without class revolution. Other currents of Vietnamese resistance still mattered. The VNQDD, a nationalist movement influenced by the Chinese Republican tradition, attempted bold action, such as the Yen Bai uprising in 1930. It was crushed. So too were communist-linked uprisings in places like Nghe Tin, where French repression was ferocious. Villages were bombed, activists jailed or killed, networks broken. Yet each repression taught survivors something about the scale of force empire would use, and about the need for deeper organization. The 1930s offered only temporary breathing room. Then the wider World War arrived in Asia. In 1940, Japanese forces entered French Indochina. This created one of the grimmer arrangements in modern colonial history. The French administration remained in place in many daily functions, while Japanese troops controlled strategy and resources. To ordinary Vietnamese, it meant exploitation by two masters at once. Rice, labor, and infrastructure were bent toward war needs. Fields shifted from food to industrial crops. Transportation disruptions worsened. Colonial extraction deepened just as security disappeared. Then came the famine of 1944 to 45. It is difficult to overstate the darkness of this catastrophe. With crop failure, transport breakdown, Japanese requisitioning, and colonial negligence all intertwining, northern Vietnam descended into mass starvation. People ate leaves, bark, roots, anything. Villages emptied, roads filled with bodies. Families watched the structure of love collapse under hunger. More than 2 million are estimated to have died. There is a particular silence around famine in historical memory, because hunger strips drama from death. It is slow, private, humiliating, and impossible to romanticize. Against that suffering, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam in 1941 after decades abroad. In remote northern zones, he and his allies reorganized the Communist Corps into a broader front, the Viet Minh, which welcomed nationalists of varying views under the central cause of independence. This was politically brilliant. A starving, occupied country does not need narrow purity first. It needs a banner wide enough to gather the desperate. The Viet Minh built local bases, literacy efforts, clinics, and rudimentary political administration. It was a shadow state forming inside the collapse of colonial legitimacy. One of history's strange turns arrived when American OSS officers made contact with Ho and his movement in 1945. They supplied some aid and intelligence coordination against Japan. For a brief moment, Americans and the future leader of revolutionary Vietnam were tactical partners. History, it must be said, enjoys irony almost as much as it enjoys blood. In March 1945, Japan swept aside the remaining French authority entirely and installed Bach Dang in a nominally independent regime under Japanese protection. It was too little and too late. The old colonial structure had cracked. The Japanese surrender in August opened a gap. Ho and the Viet Minh moved with astonishing speed. This was the August Revolution. Across towns and provinces, Viet Minh networks emerged from underground and seized offices, arsenals, and communication points. Crowds filled streets. Old authority melted. Hanoi was taken. Hue followed. Bao Dai abdicated. Saigon, too, saw revolutionary assertion, though the southern story would quickly grow more tangled. On September 2nd, Itenjobai Sisawu, in Bach Dang Square, Ho Chi Minh declared independence for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He began with words borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence, a choice at once hopeful and strategic and bitterly intelligent. If the world's most celebrated republic believed in liberty, let it hear liberty spoken in Vietnamese circumstances. The moment was immense. For the first time in generations, the dream of a sovereign Vietnam seemed present, not merely in memory or insurgent possibility, but in public governmental form. But the dream stood on unstable ground. The Japanese had surrendered. The French had not accepted loss. Great power politics moved quickly. Chinese nationalist troops came into the north as part of the surrender arrangement. British forces entered the south and facilitated the return of French control. In Saigon, the atmosphere turned violent with terrible speed. Negotiations flickered, then failed. The ink on the declaration had barely dried before war returned. By late 1946, armed conflict between the Viet Minh and France had become unavoidable. The bombing of Haiphong by French forces and the collapse of negotiations shattered the last illusions of compromise. Hanoi entered bitter street fighting. The Viet Minh eventually withdrew to the countryside and mountains, carrying with them what would become the pattern of the First Indochina War. The French held cities and roads. The Vietnamese Revolution held patience, villages, and the long ability to disappear. A new chapter of resistance had begun. It would no longer be framed by court loyalty, or by scholar petitions, or by local rising alone. It would be a modern revolutionary war, disciplined, ideological, rural, mobile, and relentless. France believed it was reclaiming a colony. Vietnam believed it was finishing a revolution. Those are very different understandings of the same battlefield, and they lead to very different depths of endurance. The next part will carry that war through jungle roads, bicycle supply lines, Dien Bien Phu, Partition, American escalation, tunnels, bomb craters, and the final reunification of a country that had spent centuries practicing the art of surviving empires. The war against France began in ruined streets and then slipped outward into the countryside, where Vietnam had so often hidden its second heartbeat. French forces could seize the visible organs of the country, the cities, ports, rail lines, and administrative centers. The Viet Minh chose instead to become circulation. They moved through villages, forests, mountain passes, and night roads. They built local support patiently, drew supplies from peasant networks, and learned again the old lesson that a stronger enemy can be weakened by being forced to control too much land for too long. By day, the French held roads and garrisons. By night, large stretches of the countryside belonged to the revolution. The war was exhausting, muddy, often invisible, and full of improvisation. It was shaped by General Von Nguyen Giap, once a history teacher, now one of the most formidable military minds of the 20th century. He did not inherit a polished professional army. He built one through stages: political discipline, guerrilla tactics, logistical imagination, and a willingness to let time fight beside him. Women carried supplies. Villagers idcade. Porters moved rice, ammunition, and messages over impossible terrain. Trails opened and closed like veins. Whole communities became parts of the war effort. This is one reason Vietnam is so difficult to understand if one looks only at armies and not at society. The army was never just the men with rifles. It was also the woman balancing grain on a shoulder pole in darkness, the child who recognized a patrol path, the elder who said little and remembered everything. The Cold War soon wrapped itself around the conflict. Communist China, after 1949, became a source of support for the Viet Minh. The United States increasingly funded the French effort, fearful that Vietnam might become another falling domino in Asia. What had begun as an anti-colonial struggle was now also a piece on the global ideological board. Yet on Vietnamese soil, the war still felt older than those theories. It was another chapter in the long refusal to remain ruled from elsewhere. French commanders searched for a decisive military solution. In 1953, they chose Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in the northwest near Laos, as the site of a fortified air-supplied stronghold. The logic looked elegant on paper. They would block Viet Minh routes, force Giap into conventional battle, and use superior firepower to crush him. But paper has a poor understanding of mountains. What followed has the feel of epic labor rather than simple strategy. JEP Force, supported by tens of thousands of workers and volunteers, dragged heavy artillery through jungle and across brutal terrain by hand, bicycle, and sheer collective stubbornness. Guns were concealed in the hills overlooking the valley. Supply systems were established where the French believed none could exist. The fortress became a trap for its builders. When the siege began in March 1954, artillery fire smashed airstrips and positions. French resupply became desperate. Trenches crept inward. Rain turned ground to thick misery. The garrison shrank under bombardment, disease, and relentless pressure. After 57 days, the French surrendered. Dien Bien Phu was not just a military defeat. It was the collapse of a colonial claim. An Asian anti-colonial army had destroyed a major European fortress in full view of the world. The Geneva Accords followed in 1954. Vietnam, having defeated France on the battlefield, found itself divided at the conference table. The 17th parallel became the temporary line between North and South. Nationwide elections were supposed to follow in 1956. Temporary arrangements, of course, are some of the longest-lived structures in politics. The North became the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. The South, under increasing American influence, moved toward a separate anti-communist state. Ngo Dinh Diem rose to power with American backing, deposed Bach Dang through a blatantly fraudulent referendum, and declared the Republic of Vietnam. The promised national elections were refused. The division hardened. Diem regime tried to present itself as modern, disciplined, and anti-communist, but it rested on narrow foundations. Catholics received disproportionate favor in a largely Buddhist country. Former Viet Minh supporters in the South were arrested, tortured, or killed under repressive laws. Land policies alienated peasants. Programs like the Strategic Hamlet Scheme uprooted villagers from ancestral land and graves, trying to place them inside fortified settlements designed more for control than for life. To separate a Vietnamese peasant from ancestral tombs is not simply administrative inconvenience. It is a wound in the moral geography of family. By 1960, Southern resistance was cohering again. The National Liberation Front, called by opponents the Viet Cong, emerged as a Southern revolutionary force linked to the North but rooted in local grievances. At the same time, the North built and expanded the supply system that would become famous as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, though it was less a single trail than a whole hidden circulatory network through Laos and Cambodia. Bomb it in one place, and movement found another vein. American involvement deepened by stages. Advisors multiplied. Aid swelled. After the instability following Diem fall in 1963, Washington moved from support to direct war. In 1965, large-scale American ground combat began. Hundreds of thousands of troops would eventually arrive, bringing with them helicopters, jets, artillery, sensors, chemical defoliants, and a logistical system of extraordinary scale. The United States carried into Vietnam perhaps the greatest concentrated military machinery on Earth. And yet, machinery has limits in a country where terrain, weather, politics, and memory all fight. American firepower was immense. Rolling thunder dropped staggering tonnage on North Vietnam. B-52 bombers shook jungle and village alike. Agent Orange stripped leaves from forests and poisoned land and bodies in ways still not finished generations later. Search and destroy missions sought to turn mobility and firepower into victory. Body counts became a language of progress. Villages were measured in terms no village would ever choose for itself. But the enemy refused to stay still long enough to fit the theory. The tunnel complexes around places like Cu Chi turned the earth itself into a second battlefield. Hospitals, command posts, storage areas, whole hidden worlds under the feet of soldiers above. American tunnel rats crawled into darkness with flashlights and pistols, hunting an enemy who seemed to dissolve into soil. There is something almost mythic in that image. A superpower, with satellites and bombers, reduced to listening for breath inside a hole in the ground. Then came Tet in 1968. During the Lunar New Year, when many in South Vietnam expected a pause, communist forces launched attacks across cities and towns throughout the South. Militarily, the offensive cost them terribly. Politically and psychologically, it was devastating for the United States and South Vietnam. The attack on the American embassy in Saigon, even though repelled, shattered the claim that the war was nearly won. If the enemy could strike there, then what exactly had victory meant all along? The same year exposed one of the war's darkest moral wounds at My Lai, where American soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed civilians. The massacre, once revealed, burned away layers of official language and left behind a simpler truth. That overwhelming force in a broken war corrodes the men asked to carry it. Vietnamese civilians across the country had already borne bombing, displacement, artillery, and terror from many directions. My Lai became infamous not because it was the only horror, but because it was documented enough to force itself into public conscience. At home in the United States, opposition to the war deepened. Images of burning villages, body bags, and official optimism no longer matched. The war had become a wound in American politics, morality, and self-image. In Vietnam, it remained something even older, a continuation of the national struggle through yet another foreign intervention. President Nixon sought exit without admitting defeat. Vietnamization aimed to shift more combat to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew. At the same time, the war widened into Cambodia and Laos through bombing and covert operations meant to cut the revolutionary supply network. Instead, the region bled more deeply. The Paris Peace Accords in 1973 formally ended direct American military involvement, but they did not resolve the conflict. South Vietnam remained dependent on aid and politically fragile. The North and its southern allies remained organized, patient, and convinced time still favored them. When American assistance was sharply reduced and Northern forces launched major operations in 1975, the collapse came with stunning speed. Cities fell one after another. Panic spread through the South. Crowded roads filled with soldiers, families, carts, trucks, and the debris of a state losing coherence. Saigon, long the great urban symbol of anti-communist Vietnam, waited under a sky full of dread and helicopters. Then, on April 30th, Iten Bai Tisuwu, North Vietnamese tanks broke through the gates of the presidential palace. The last American evacuation from the embassy roof had already become an image for the age, a picture of power retreating upward while history entered through the gate. South Vietnam surrendered. The country was reunited under communist rule. For Americans, the war often remains a story of quagmire, protest, trauma, and political fracture. For Vietnamese memory, it sits inside a much longer arc, not a detached event, but another immense chapter in a 4,000-year struggle to preserve a distinct existence between larger powers, ideologies, and ambitions. That does not make the suffering less. It makes it part of a larger inheritance. And the suffering was immense. Millions of Vietnamese died across the French and American wars. Villages were erased. Cities were scarred. Forests were poisoned. Families were divided across ideology, region, class, and exile. Re-education camps, refugee departures, post-war hardship, all waited beyond the battlefield. Reunification was not a magical ending where grief politely stepped aside. It was another beginning, stern and costly. Still, when one steps back from the long river of the story, certain themes glow with unusual steadiness. Myth mattered. The Trung Sisters mattered. Bach Dang mattered. The Lai and Tran mattered. The Southward March mattered. The Tay Son mattered. Ho Chi Minh mattered. Dien Bien Phu mattered. Tet mattered. Apol Etsusin Onihunol Ofimo Helfias mattered. Perhaps the deepest thread is this. Vietnam never stayed still long enough to become what outsiders expected. China expected assimilation and met resistance. The Mongols expected surrender and met swamp, fever, and stakes. France expected a colony and met a nation. The United States expected a military solution and met a society capable of turning war into endurance. Even Vietnam-owned rulers repeatedly expected obedience from below and found revolt instead. The country has a long habit of frustrating certainty. The whole story, from Dragon Lord and Fairy Princess to tanks entering Saigon, is not a straight line. It is more like a braided river, myth and mud, scholarship and hunger, prayer and artillery, dynasties and peasant feet, all moving together and apart and together again. Yet the central current remains astonishingly clear. Vietnam adapted, endured, absorbed, resisted, fractured, reunited, and remained stubbornly itself. So when people say Vietnam is a story of farmers defeating empires, the phrase is not quite complete, though it is not wrong. It is also a story of villages outlasting theories, of memory outliving occupation, of a civilization built not only by kings and generals, but by rice growers, porters, teachers, mothers, scribes, and the nameless many whose patience turned survival into continuity. Vietnam answer, given again and again in different voices, has never been simple, but it has been unmistakable. It lives in river silt, temple smoke, examination stone, burnt village walls, tunnel earth, and the careful hands that plant rice after armies have gone. It lives in a people who learned that survival is not passive at all. It is work, memory, patience, and the refusal to let someone else finish your story for you. We are still here. Good night.